Hello everybody, this is Dr. Stringer. Today we're going to be talking about police misconduct and police integrity. I have a few things to add from the textbook. We'll talk about an article too, which is in D12 for you all, that I really like. It's from Police Chief Magazine. It's called the Continuum of Compromise. So I recommend you take a look at that. It's from obviously Police Chief Magazine, so it's not really long or complex like an academic article. But I think it's a pretty good layout or idea theory, so to speak, of kind of how misconduct might begin. We obviously don't see officers begin with extreme types of misconduct or abuse, excessive force, brutality, things like that. And that tends to go along with a lot of our criminological theories that, people don't start off committing the most heinous, or they don't often do that. There are some exceptions, of course. But they don't often start off committing the most serious of offenses. They start off small with smaller things and kind of work their way up, so to speak, or progress into more serious things. And that I think it applies to misconduct and integrity and issues of that as well. So with that, we'll talk about some of the stuff from your textbook as well. Hopefully you'll read those things as well. One thing I want to talk about is kind of what we call misconduct. Misconduct is often not seen as being criminal. It can be, but misconduct is often more minor offenses. Things that officers might do that they're not really supposed to. It's obviously misconduct, so it's not proper conduct. And so there's some examples of this: meals and different services, kickbacks, things. A few examples in here: protection. Some departments don't allow you to do private security on part-time. However, that's become much more relaxed, so to speak, in recent years. However, there are still some departments that don't let you do that. A lot of times departments have regulations of what you're allowed to use during private security. Like, you can wear your uniform, you can carry your gun, but you may or may not be able to carry or use your department-issued taser. Oftentimes, officers might not have their portable radios with them, or they may do that. They won't be assigned a call sign, obviously, if they're on private security, so they wouldn't really be using it. These are just some different examples. One of the things that has become more prolific too in more recent years is meals and services that officers might be provided for free. Some departments have actually created not legislation, but policies, SOPs, standard operating procedures, against accepting free coffee, free meals, and kickbacks from different businesses. And that gets into a little bit of an ethical gray area, right? Should officers accept free coffee and things like that? The logic being is that, if you have one place, one store, one gas station that offers officers free coffee all the time, then officers will be more likely to go there, right? And even congregate possibly around this store. And so then they're kind of getting a little bit of free security there. And people might be less likely to rob that store, whereas you have another gas station on the other side of town, they don't give them free coffee or free hot dogs or whatever. They're not getting that same free security. I know one department this became such an issue where officers, when they weren't on a call, they would all kind of hang out at this one gas station. And so they created a policy that no more than 2 police officers could be at the same place, the same gas station or grocery store or anything else like that, unless they were on a call. Because obviously this can create a problem if you have every police officer in the city. It's a bit of an exaggeration, but say you have 5 police officers that are all at the same gas station or whatever restaurant, and they're all kind of hanging out there. There's not really patrol going on in all the other areas of where those officers' beats might be, where they should be. So that can get into a bit of a gray area there. So departments are trying to kind of work with that through creating administrative policies. The other thing is it can kind of get into kind of officers may feel some sort of entitlement, and we'll talk about entitlement. And this is kind of how officers might feel as though they kind of deserve this professional courtesy of getting coffee, right? And so then if they don't get it, they could foreseeably, possibly get a little upset about that. Another thing that, and this is a much more prolific up north, is the kind of professional courtesies that off-duty officers might get for speeding and things like that, because officers might be less likely to write tickets to on-duty or off-duty officers and things like that. And so off-duty officers might be more likely to speed. If you're interested, there is a very interesting dash camera footage of a it's a Miami police officer in a pursuit by a Florida state police officer. And the Miami PD officer is, I'm not sure if he's on duty or not, but he's in his marked police car and he's in uniform. And he's just speeding down the interstate, and this Florida state police officer pulls him over, follows him for quite some time with the lights and siren going. It's essentially a high-speed pursuit. Pulls him out of the car, and I think she arrested him, if I don't recall correctly. But or if I do recall correctly. So, that Miami police officer may have thought that maybe the speed limits didn't apply to them, and Miami PD may not have, pulled him over, written him a ticket for that. But the state police, that's a different organization. In my experience, state police tend to have a little bit higher level of professionalism sometimes than your local PDs, but that doesn't always apply. And there's wonderful local PDs out there too, so don't take that to mean that all local PDs are not that way. But the state police are more likely to just say, well, look, you're doing this and I'm writing you a ticket. This especially applies to drunk driving and things like that. There was a department up north where, back in Virginia, the actually sheriff was pulled over by a police officer. And this was the sheriff. He wasn't a sheriff deputy. He was the sheriff. And he was drunk. The officer called the, captain, sergeant, everybody to see what am I supposed to do? This is the sheriff. Can I arrest him? Should I arrest him? What am I to do here? And they went all the way up to the chief of police, and I think they said, arrest him. He's drunk and he's driving. So that sheriff probably had some sort of sense of entitlement that, hey, I'm the sheriff. I can drive, and this rule doesn't kind of apply to me. And so that's obviously a big problem, right? So we want the law to apply to everybody, regardless of where you wear a badge or not. And so that can be this kind of sense of entitlement, something to watch out for among police officers, because it does happen sometimes. Please don't think any of these things that we talk about with regard to misconduct and stuff like that applies to all police officers. But there are some wonderful police officers out there, and just like any other profession, there's some bad apples, right? And bad departments, bad areas. So, these are things that apply to some. As hopefully we'll get to applying to less of them, right? And so just another example, as a chief, I can play golf instead of attending the conference, even though I'm going at the community's expense. And so this gets into kind of what Gilmartin and Harris talk about. Gilmartin and Harris is the authors of the Continuum of Compromise, where they say that kind of this entitlement is kind of, you owe us as cops for putting our lives on the line, to serving the streets and protecting you, and so for that, in exchange for that, we get these special privileges, so to speak. Just keep in mind, police officers don't get paid all that well either. Pay has actually gone up in recent years because of the problems with recruitment, given that it's not that popular of a profession. And so the Continuum of Compromise, I won't move forward a little bit, talks about the transition from honest cop to compromised officer. One of the things is that their theory posits that the most ethically bound, most ethical police officers are usually the youngest police officers. Those police officers who've just gotten out of the academy. They've been had all these ethics kind of drilled into their brains of what they should and shouldn't do, and over time, the theory is that they kind of get exposed more to the department or police subculture. In some examples, they may or may not be told that they have to forget all that stuff that they learned in the department, because that might conflict with the department subculture, things like that. And so there's a few key parts of this that we'll kind of go through. The first is acts of omission, and we'll go into a little bit more detail of each of these, so I won't go through each of them now. The second is acts of commission. So first you're omitting things, you're not doing things that you should. Then next you start to do things that you shouldn't do. And so that's acts of commission administrative. And then you may have acts of commission that actually rise to the criminal level that aren't just administrative things that you aren't supposed to do. So an act of commission, administrative act of commission might be that you accept free coffee when your department has a rule against that. Maybe you're hanging out with 3 police officers at a gas station when your department has a rule that only 2 police officers should talk to each other when they're not on a call. Something like that. These are just, they're not crimes, but they go against some sort of administrative policy and directive. Then we get into this idea of kind of entitlement versus accountability. We already talked about entitlement, but accountability is being accountable to yourself, to the rules of your department, to the law, to the people that you serve, the community, things like that. And then the last part that we'll talk about is loyalty versus integrity. And that's a very important part in policing as it has to do with the police subculture, because as a person, as an individual officer, you have a sense of integrity, right? That I'm not going to do this and I'm not going to do that because that's unethical, right? Or I'm not going to support someone else doing this. But at the same time, with regard to policing especially, you have kind of this loyalty to your fellow officers, to what's known as kind of the thin blue line and things like that, that you don't want to necessarily get your fellow officers in trouble. They're seen as your friends and things like that, as well as the military and the police have this in common, which is that in no other real professions other than the military and the police are you really in life or death situations where your life could be in the hands of one of your colleagues. You don't want the guy that you're calling for backup to be the guy that you told internal affairs was accepting coffee or whatever last week, right? Because then that person might not be in that big of a hurry to come and help you. This is all theoretical, obviously. So things like that. They might not be willing so much to put their life on the line to help you, and so that gets at kind of this conflict of your own integrity versus the loyalty to your fellow officers. And these are all important things to think about as police officers and as society, is how this conflict can arise and what to do about it, right? So that's kind of a good summary, so to speak, of your kind of continuum of compromise. So acts of omission would just be, like I said, you're not doing things that you should. Maybe you're not writing tickets. One of the things that happened not so long ago in Atlanta was that officers were kind of not really replying on the radio when they were, asking for officers to reply to different areas and things like that. I think at one point the sergeant got on the radio and said, "We're not replying to calls right now," or something like that. Responding to calls, I don't remember exactly. But essentially, if you're not doing your job the way that you're supposed to, maybe you're not writing tickets, People are speeding past you and you're just sitting in your car taking a nap. You know, and then acts of commission criminal obviously are pretty obvious, right? In your book, and I'm sorry, the article will get into more detail with those. But anyway, so your textbook gives you some kind of examples. First is known as kind of the slippery slope hypothesis, and this kind of goes along with kind of the idea of the continuum of compromise, and so there's kind of some consistency there. So we'll kind of talk about that briefly, that you know, corruption begins with small payoffs or well-intended practices, and then eventually leads to bigger and bigger crimes as things move on. Structural explanation, and this is usually related to problems within the administrative structure of a department or even the police subculture. So some things to think about with regard to that is, you know, a department may encourage or turn a blind eye to certain types of misconduct or corruption, particularly if it involves crime control, if it's politically advantageous to do certain things that may be unethical. In the interest of crime control, department may turn a blind eye to that. One example might be if you think about the New York stop and frisk policy that was pretty much shut down by the Supreme Court a few years ago. It's more than a few years ago now. But that they were essentially stopping all of the non-white pedestrians in New York City and frisking them. And if they caught them with weapons, then they would arrest them and seize the weapons or drugs. And then if they didn't, they just let them go. You know, some might say the department kind of turned a blind eye to this practice because it was in the interest of reducing crime, reducing violence, and things like that, but obviously it's unethical. It went to the Supreme Court and they said, no, you cannot do that. That is absolutely racial profiling and it's unethical, unconstitutional, all sorts of things, right? So that's a good example of that. Rotten apple explanation. This is this kind of idea that an otherwise honest department, there are just a few bad officers who are operating on their own. This, I'm sure, has happened and does happen. I tend to be a little bit more skeptical about this explanation, particularly when it's misconduct that hasn't been addressed by the department. I have a hard time believing that if there are a few rotten apples and they haven't been disciplined by the department, that the department doesn't know, or at least the higher-ups don't know about it and are kind of turning a blind eye to it. And if they're doing that, then it's not really just a rotten apple explanation, right? So, you know, that's often the one that you'll see in the media that the police will use if something comes to light, that there's some officers that have done something bad. I think Derek Chauvin, they used that with him. You know, oh, he's just a rotten apple. But you think about Derek Chauvin you know, he'd been on the force for 30-some years. He'd had previous complaints, and he's still, you know, on the force. He hasn't been removed. He's also been made a field training officer. So I guess I think it was Minneapolis. The Minneapolis PD's response to his behavior was to make him to train other people, which obviously is probably not the greatest idea. So when you have somebody like that who has previous complaints that the department knows about and has failed to act on, you know, I think that implicates the department to some extent, at least. You know, I don't know the context of those previous complaints, but anyway, I know the Department of Justice is investigating those as well now too. One movie that I've shown in the past to my face-to-face students is Pride and Glory. I think this is a good kind of explanation of this and kind of the police subculture and things like that. And so, you know, if you've seen that, maybe you'll look into that. Anyway, the Dirty Harry phenomenon. So this originates. I got a picture of Dirty Harry in here somewhere. Oh, there he is. So this originates from an old. Gosh, I forget this guy's name. Dirty Harry. Clint Eastwood. This originates from an old Clint Eastwood movie called Dirty Harry. And this talks about, this theory written by Clockers in 1980, talks about how police officers may kind of rationalize their unethical behavior in the interests of some greater good. Essentially that the ends justifies the means, right? And so, you know, be mindful of this, because when I describe the movie, people often will describe the movie when they're describing the theory to me, and the theory is kind of based on the movie, but they're still not the same thing. But in the movie, Clint Eastwood he shot the guy in the leg. You know, you probably heard of the famous quote, "Do you feel lucky, punk?" and things like that. He used some other brutality tactics to essentially get the whereabouts of this girl that had been kidnapped, this little girl. And in Dirty Harry's mind, it was okay for him to do these things, even though they're illegal, they're unethical, they're unconstitutional, and also end up in the evidence being excluded pursuant to the exclusionary rule. But he did it all, and in his mind it was okay because he was doing it to save this little girl. Consequently, the little girl had already died, I think, by the time he got to her, and so he didn't end up saving her. But in his mind, it was okay to do these things. And to be honest, I don't know, if I have a daughter, so if someone had kidnapped my daughter, I may do the same things to try to convince him to tell me where my daughter is. I don't know if I'd shoot him, but anyway, that's neither here nor there. But as a police officer, you know, you don't want your police officers going and doing those things. The problem with it too is because these things were so illegal. All the evidence that he collected, the confession of where the girl was, and I think some other things, were excluded from the case against the guy that had kidnapped her, and then the case ended up being dismissed. So that's a big problem. You know, you don't want that to happen. It's a thing to be mindful of, you know, for those of you that go into policing or end up dealing with these sorts of things, because rationalizing our behavior is a very prolific phenomenon in society in general, right? People will think, okay, well, I've got to achieve this, and so how am I going to do that? Probably familiar with strain theory of criminology, that, you know, if people don't have a legitimate means of accomplishing their goals and achieving success, then they'll resort to illegitimate means. And so, you know, these are things to think about as well with regard to policing. Police violence. This is another one that we probably will cover to some extent with use of force. And this, obviously, excessive use of force is absolutely unethical. It's absolutely misconduct. Police brutality is also, you know, a more extreme version of this. And some students in the past have considered use of force, just when they talk about use of force, and they call it all excessive force. All force is not excessive. There is some force that is reasonable. If you saw the video of Officer Kyle Dinkiller when he was shot, it would have absolutely been reasonable for him to shoot back at the person that was shooting him. That would not have been considered excessive force by pretty much anybody that I've ever talked to that knows anything about police use of force. That would not be excessive. That would not be brutality. That would have been reasonably justified force. And so be mindful of that you shouldn't just call all police use of force excessive force. Now, if someone had come and, I don't know, just been non-compliant and they'd been shot by the police, that would be a different story. You know, that could be into excessive or brutality. So some examples, what level of force? Usually what we consider is the level of force necessary, the minimum amount of force necessary to get the person under control, is what is considered reasonable. It's kind of a reasonable person standard. What would a reasonable person in that position, under Graham versus Connor, consider to be reasonable use of force? So if someone's shooting at you, it's reasonable to shoot back at them. If someone is just cussing at you, it's not usually reasonable to shoot them for cussing at you, right? Some examples of brutality, You've probably heard of Rodney King. That was one of the first that was actually videotaped. Walter Scott shooting, I've often said, is one of the biggest examples of kind of brutality and this excessive force or brutality used against black males. If you haven't seen that, you can Google that if you want to. Essentially, Walter Scott was running away, and the officer shot him in the back as he was running away. He was unarmed, and that would obviously be considered, at the very least, excessive force. I would say brutality and murder. So those are some examples of that. Rodney King was actually beaten by several police officers with batons. This was recorded back with a big, huge, old videotape camera. Back when I was a kid, they had those. So now these things, police officers are much more accountable nowadays because of everybody's got a cell phone, right? So we can all record what's going on, which wasn't the case, even 20 years ago. So that's giving police officers more accountability, which I think is a good thing, as well as the body cameras. Those are actually helping not only to hold police officers accountable, but in some instances to actually exonerate police officers when there are accounts made that they've used excessive force or that they've done this and they've done that. The body cameras have actually been used in several instances to help to exonerate the police officers. So that's a good thing as well, because it gives you, this is what happened. There's no he said, she said, so to speak. Brutality tends to occur a lot more with people that are perceived as being lower class, or drug addicts and things like that. I don't agree with that at all, but it just happens to happen that way. A lot of it is, I think, they don't think that those types of people have the resources to be able to make a complaint and hire a lawyer and things like that, right? It's okay if we knock him around a little. He's just a junkie. This quote, So be mindful of that. I've heard stories of police officers like breaking homeless people's ribs, and they kick them. They're sleeping in like a public place, and they kick them trying to wake them up. And maybe they kicked them too hard. Obviously, if they're breaking their ribs, maybe they shouldn't be kicking them anyway. But anyway, I don't want to go and bore you all too much, because I'm sure some of you have heard some of these things. So anyway, so this is just a little bit of data on when do you think a police officer is justified in roughing a person up. And I always find it interesting that it says disrespect for police is the number one. To make an arrest, I would say, I guess, is okay, as long as the force is what's needed to make that arrest. When you know they're guilty, no. To obtain information, obviously not. When it's impossible to avoid, I guess I could kind of see that. Like, if it's impossible to avoid making this arrest or stopping this person from doing whatever they're doing to potentially harm people, I guess I'd go with that. But disrespect for the police. But this one is very important to the police. And we get into this a lot in my graduate course about how police officers really, many of them, see that if people treat them with disrespect, that is crossing a line. And then some of them see that they have to then kind of teach them to respect the police. And that gets into what's known as kind of street justice and things like that, because many police officers within the culture are kind of socialized to, if you allow this person to disrespect you, then that opens the door to this slippery slope to where they might be more likely to assault you. They might be more likely to resist, things like that. And I guess I don't buy the slippery slope argument, but to some extent, there is a correlation there. People who are disrespectful of the police, who mouth off and cuss them, and don't show them any kind of respect and are hostile, are more likely to resist arrest and more likely to assault the police officers and things like that. So be mindful of your demeanor when you're interacting with the police, because that's something that's constantly going into a threat assessment during every situation, and you don't want to kind of make any hair stick up on the back of anybody's neck. But anyway, all right. So the use of force, I'll talk about this just briefly. Deadly force, and this gets into the issue of Walter Scott with him running away. Previously, prior to Tennessee versus Garner in 1985, you could actually shoot fleeing felons as they were running away. Tennessee versus Garner said no, you can't, shoot fleeing felons unless they pose a significant and imminent threat to someone else. So if you see someone with an AK-47 and they're running away from you and into a church, and you have reason to believe that they're going to go into that church or school or whatever venue and shoot a bunch of other people, then that's a bit different story, right? Because then you have reason, and you better be able to articulate that reason too. You have reason to defend those other people's lives and shoot that person even though they're running away from you, they're running towards someone else that they intend to harm. But you can't just shoot them in the back if they're running away. Before that, you could shoot fleeing prisoners and things like that. You would see the old chain gangs, and the guys had, shotguns, and if they ran away, they could just shoot them in the back. Part of that rationale was based on earlier Supreme Court opinions that kind of when you were convicted of a felony, you kind of forfeited a lot of your rights. One of those was against excessive force, and so. Nowadays that's not necessarily the case, although you still, have to deal with some excessive force, I think, when you're in a correctional institution, and you still forfeit some rights when you're convicted of a felony, so I wouldn't recommend it. So I show this, and I don't remember if I have this link on D2L, but it's this hula hoop lady she's tasered repeated times, and this is a great example of excessive force and maybe even, I'd say, brutality, at least excessive force. She has a medical problem where she can't get her hand behind her back. And if you Google hula hoop lady tasered, I think you can find it on YouTube. If not, you can email me if it's not on D2L. But she can't get her hand behind her back because she's been in some kind of car accident or something. And the officer, this is back where I'm from in Norfolk, and the officer is repeatedly telling her, put your hands behind your back, put your hands behind your back, and she doesn't do it. She's trying to show him her medical alert, necklace, and she's saying she has her medical alert paperwork or ID or something in her back pocket, but he doesn't seem to really register these things, and this is what is known as kind of passive noncompliance. So that she's not like actively attacking the officer; she's just not doing what he wants her to do. This is passive noncompliance, and most of the time, in most states, you're not supposed to use a taser for someone who's being passively non-compliant. I know that applies in Georgia as well, because we've had some cases related to the tasers where they were telling someone to get out of the car, they didn't do it, and then they tased them, and that led to some problems. So when you have someone that's being actively non-compliant, or they're being threatening, or some sort of way, then taser is acceptable. But back to that threshold of minimum use of force, it would have been much easier for him to just handcuff her in the front, or even move her hand himself to the back. I did talk to the chief of that department after this, and there was a lawsuit and all this stuff. So after that was settled, she talked to me a little bit about it, and one of the biggest things that she said was, after police officers got tasers, they really started, some of them started to not want to put their hands on people and keep a little bit more distance and use the taser. And this is related to officer safety. There's tons of research out there that shows that officers are more likely to be injured when they put their hands on somebody. A lot of that has to do with, you have to get closer to someone to put your hands on them, versus, taser can work I'd say up to 20 feet. The people that sell them say that they work, 30 feet or something like that, but to get both prongs to have any kind of accuracy and both go into the person's skin, I wouldn't trust it too much after 20 feet, maybe 25, I don't know. But, so you can still maintain that 20 feet, which is usually substantial enough to prevent any injuries to the officers. Once you get into hands-on things, It can result in more injuries. So that's kind of feeds into those decisions. So legislative control, if for some reason someone thinks that their rights have been violated, they can sue under the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And this is important because you can sue these state actors in federal court. It creates a little bit of a conflict to sue maybe a state or local police officer in the state court because they're there all the time, and anyway, I'm not going to get into all that because it's not a courts class. But essentially, you can sue them in state court. That's actually what happened to the officer. I think his name was Slager, who shot Walter Scott. He actually didn't get charged in state court, but then the family filed a suit under Civil Rights Act, or it might have been the DOJ investigated for a civil rights violation. I don't remember off the top of my head. But essentially, he wasn't charged with doing anything wrong in state court, but then he was taken to federal court for shooting Walter Scott, and I think he got like 30 years. You can, fact check me and look into that too if you're interested. But I won't go too much into that. One of the things that might help with some of this is kind of decriminalizing some of these victimless crimes. A lot of times, these cases where you have excessive force and brutality, pretty much a lot of different cases that the police involve are these kind of minor offenses. And not to say that those aren't important for catching more serious criminals. Ted Bundy was caught, through being pulled over. I think there's another serial killer, I can't remember which one it was, that was caught because he got a parking ticket where he committed one of the offenses. I don't remember who that was. But anyway, so that's one of the things that can help to reduce misconduct, is just to kind of reduce the amount of times that the police are having to deal with these things. Internal affairs. Your book, I think, still calls it internal affairs. Most departments don't really call it that anymore. It's kind of moved into calling it something called ethics and conduct, or the division of professional standards, things like that. There's probably still some departments that call it internal affairs. I haven't checked every department in the whole country. So these are the kind of the division of the police department that investigates allegations related to misconduct, corruption, things like that. Anytime an officer discharges their firearm, anytime there's a use of force, report filed, they'll look into those sorts of things, things like that. Anytime a civilian is killed or wounded. In Georgia, it's actually interesting because I don't think every state does this, but in Georgia, they'll actually have the GBI investigate, which I think gives it a little bit more legitimacy than having, like, if there's a shooting that involves a Cobb County PD officer, having the internal affairs division of Cobb County PD investigated. But instead, it's not, essentially, quote unquote, the officer's buddies that are investigating him or the department. It's the GBI, so it's taken to a different, I think it gives it more objectivity and more legitimacy. So that's something that's unique to Georgia. There might be some other states that do it too, but I know all states do not do that. At least not yet. Civilian review boards. So this is another thing that is kind of unique. It doesn't happen everywhere. And I know Atlanta has a civilian review board. I've actually gotten them to come and talk to my face-to-face classes before. And last I checked, there was one other civilian review board in the state of Georgia. One. So there's two total. And so I think the other one was Savannah, but I don't remember off the top of my head. But anyway, so these are kind of civilians who will review complaints made against police officers, and they will kind of give recommendations as to what to do. This gives kind of a little bit more legitimacy to the process too. One of the big things, some limitations, is that you get some resistance from police officers. Oops. because they're like, well, the civilians aren't police officers, so they don't know everything that we know. They don't know procedures. And I think that's, it's important to know police procedures and know what reasonable use of force is and what excessive force is and what brutality is and the different distinguishing characteristics there in order to be able to evaluate what is good use of force and what is not. One of the big things with civilian review boards is they lack any kind of investigative authority, and at least in Georgia and in most states that I've heard of, they don't really have any authority, so to speak, with regard to what happens either. So, for example, they might investigate a complaint against an officer for excessive force. They can, kind of look into it and give their recommendation to the chief, or the chief's designing as to, like, maybe you should terminate this officer, maybe you should be suspended, blah, blah, blah. But they don't have the authority to make that decision. That decision lies with the chief to decide whether they want to take the recommendation or not. One thing I haven't mentioned yet is that when it comes to excessive force, a lot of times that can be resolved with training, particularly with younger officers. They might use a little bit more force as necessary, and you can kind of train them and be like, well, should something similar like this happen, you could, do this instead, and that would be a little bit more reasonable and things like that. So that can oftentimes be resolved with training, because excessive force oftentimes doesn't come from a place of intentionally, harming this person in an unreasonable way. Now, brutality is not the same. Brutality, more times than not, involves some sort of intent to inflict harm onto someone else for the purposes of retaliation or street justice or something like that. And oftentimes training will not alleviate, so to speak, that intent and the brutality, and oftentimes officers have to be just kind of terminated or something like that. Particularly if they're an older, more seasoned officer, it's like, well, you should know better than this. One thing that students often ask is, if you're a police officer and you're discharged, can you go and work somewhere else? And that is absolutely true. You can apply to go and work somewhere else. So if you're fired from Atlanta PD, you can go and apply to Cobb County PD. Now, I can tell you, if you're fired from Atlanta PD, you're not going to get a job at Cobb County PD. The opposite might work. You could possibly get fired from Cobb County PD and maybe get hired at Atlanta PD, because Atlanta PD has a lot harder time filling their ranks than Cobb County PD is. The Cobb County is much more selective. But it depends on what you get fired for. If you do something egregious enough to where you lose your post certification in Georgia, you can't be a police officer anywhere in Georgia. But that don't stop you from going to Alabama and being a police officer there. Now, of course, they're going to do a background check, and they're going to find out why you were fired, why you lost your post certification, and all that. And that's more likely than not going to impact your ability to serve as a police officer there. But it's not necessarily the case all the time, unless you're convicted of a felony, or drunk driving has become really a big one nowadays, and domestic violence or automatic disqualifiers. But I thought I would mention that because students often ask about that. Anyway, so what can we do about these things? Preventative control, internal accountability, tight supervision, abolition of corrupting procedures. I've got a couple of examples here. This guy here, if you can Google this if you want, I'm not going to play the video. But this guy was given all kinds of cavity searches and stuff because they said his buttocks were clenched. So they thought that this meant that he had something hidden up there, and they did all sorts of x-rays and cavity searches of him and didn't find anything. There's been people that have been tased and caught fire. This occurred when tasers initially came out because the propellant in the OC spray was flammable. And so if you OC sprayed somebody, and then tase them afterwards, then you had the potential for the sparks from the taser to catch the OC spray on fire. Now they've started using a different type of propellant in the OC spray and changed things around, so you don't really have that anymore. Getting back to the issues of loyalty versus integrity and things like that, the Frank Serpaco case is another good one. You can watch documentaries on that and stuff. I won't bore you all with the details of that, but that was actually based on a true story about a guy who went and kind of, essentially, blew the whistle on things that were going on that he thought were unethical. He chose his integrity over, his loyalty to other officers. And a final note with that, one of the things that I find throughout, talking to police officers and other things with research is that, when it comes to that thin blue line, most police officers will tell you that I will not go and rat out another police officer. They get into their loyalty that way. They're like, I'm not going to go and tell on somebody else. But at the same time, they're not going to lie for another police officer either. Because that, in their minds, gets too much into their integrity. And maybe it's more than just the integrity, too. But one of the things that if you're a police officer and you're caught lying, in most departments with any ethical standards, they will fire you immediately, just for lying. And so a lot of police officers are like, well, I might be loyal, I might have some loyalty here, but I'm not risking my job and my career to lie for someone else. And I think that's, fairly reasonable. I don't know, though, because in some situations I feel like a police officer has a duty to kind of rat out his colleagues if they're doing something highly offensive. Maybe not if they're getting free coffee from somewhere or something petty, but, and you all might have differences of opinion on that. That's fine. That's just kind of sharing kind of my 2 cents. It's going to add to what you all read in your textbook this week. So with that, I will kind of sign off, and I think I've talked to you for almost an hour here, so I'm probably about ready to end this lecture. So if anything comes up and you have any questions, let me know. If not, I will see you next time. Thanks.